introduction today. My presentation will focus on the traumatic impact of the Sikh genocide of 1980. So this is just the timeline of my presentation. I'll start off with giving some historical factual information about the genocide. Then I'll give three accounts of survivors and victims. And then I will be talking about political torture and the physical and psychological impacts of political torture, how it manifests and affects individuals, families, and communities. And I will also be talking about recent events and how that is tied to the political torture that was occurring in 1984. So I'm going to start talking about the historical events and the facts. And so I just want to give a disclaimer, due to time, I'm only going to be giving more like historical information about 1984. I do encourage all of you to go in depth and do research about what happened in 1984, but I will be briefly discussing what happened during that time. So as we all know, the Indian government launched an attack at Sri Harmandir, which we all know is it's a holy shrine, which is very important to Sikhi. And so the attacks, it happened during May 31st until June 6th. And there were massive attacks happening during that time. And I will briefly be going over each day what had happened. And again, I really encourage all of you to do detailed research about what was happening every day. But I will be addressing some important factual information, which is very important to understand psychological impacts of the genocide. So I'm going to start off on May 25th, and during this time 100,000 Indian Army troops were deployed throughout the Punjab in important gurdwaras and also, like I had mentioned before, at the Sri Harmandir. I know in the media we always look at, there's always a picture of Sri Harmandir being attacked, but we also have to understand that it was happening throughout Punjab. So in the bend, on the roads, everywhere, there were massive attacks happening. That's why when you go online, there's a lot of pictures you'll see that a lot of individuals are being attacked on the streets. And then on June 1st, there were actually many hundreds and thousands of individuals there praying during the anniversary of Sri Guru Arjan Dev Ji. So it's important to keep that into mind, because knowing that there's a religious event happening, there's going to be a lot of individuals. There was an attack happening during that time, and a lot of the Indian police, they opened fire, and the Sikh militants were fighting back. And when I do say Sikh militant, I mean freedom fighters. I know that word can be misused. I just wanted to clarify that. So during this time, there was the massive attacks happening, fire, bullets. This is why you probably see pictures of a lot of religious structures having bullets and being burned down. So next, June 3rd, it was very chaotic during that time. A lot of communication regarding phone lines were all cut. There were roadblocks, curfews. A lot of journalists were prohibited from exiting or doing any type of paperwork cover on what was happening in Punjab. So there was a lot of communication cut. And this is very important because whatever was happening in Punjab, nobody was knowing about it. And that's very tactful in that manner, if you think about that. And then during June 4th, the Indian Army started firing, and there was a gun battle. And I know online I found out that there were 100 individuals that passed away on both sides. But I just want to clarify that there is no accurate number of how many individuals passed away, even regarding how many Sikh individuals have passed away. And we don't know the exact number. Even though it says 100, I really will want you to think that's more than 100. And this ties back to a lot of missing reports, which I will address later why there are missing reports. So I'm going to go over 3 quotes. And these 3 quotes are from victims and survivors. And the reason I started off with these quotes is I really want you to keep in mind with these quotes in mind when I'm presenting about political torture and how the information I'm going to be addressing, how you can find this information in these personal narratives. So the first one, it begins by saying, on November 1st, Kaur, her 3 sons and her husbands were at home. Here is how she described the attack. 3 of the men ran out and were set on fire. My youngest son stayed in the house with me, but they came into the house. These young boys, 14 and 16 years old, began to drag my son out, even though he was hiding behind me. They tore my clothes and stripped me naked in front of my son. They raped me right there in front of my son, in my own house. There were young boys, maybe 8 of them. The second one. Kaur, she's a mother of 3 young children, and she reported, when people begged for water, some soldiers told them to drink the mixture of blood and urine on the ground. And lastly, this is an individual that had reported, this is what they had seen, dead bodies were taken in municipal garbage trucks around the clock, burnt in homes of 20 or more. So these 3 codes, as you can see, are very intense, very heavy, and I will be illustrating the type of trauma these victims might or may have been or are actually experiencing. But it's important to keep into mind, I know sometimes it can be very distant to us because it happened in 1984, but I really want you to keep these stories in mind to know that what if you were in this place and what would be happening to you if you were in the exact moment during 1984. Next, I would be addressing what political torture is. The definition is torture is defined as a deliberate, systematic, or an infliction of physical or mental suffering by one or more peoples attacking alone or on the orders of any authority to force another person to yield information, to make a confession, or for another reason. And so as a result of torture, 2 outcomes occur. One is physical injuries, and the second one is mental trauma. And so I will be addressing how these 2 factors manifest in 1984. So tortures, they aim to gain this power and control by instilling fear, humiliation, and shame. And so I'll be going over these 3 factors and giving examples from 1984. So for fear, so during this time, a lot of Sikhs were in fear. You know, there were all these words kept going on, dada, sanu dada. Like there was so much fear, and it has to do with the police, the power that the police had during that time. And this fear was so great, so big, in the fact that it was estimated that 85% of families did not seek actually any judicial assistance for family members that had disappeared or were wrongfully killed. Even if they were in front of their eyes, they had no power to go back to the government and tell them or get any justice for those family members. And this fear is still important because it's still here in survivors. This fear hasn't gone away. For many Sikhs that are living overseas, they're still in fear. So when I say overseas, I mean like US, Canada, you name it, any country. Like a lot of Sikhs who had actually immigrated to many countries, and they have a fear of now going back to India because there's this, the thought that something's going to happen to me, they'll identify me, and they will wrongfully kill me like they did to my family members. And so the second one is humiliation. And so this example of this is a lot of experiences of rape and sexual assault and abuse that were happening throughout 1984 and after preceding that. And so that's humiliation, like thinking about those cases, and this was happening in the streets. It's not like it was happening in closed doors. The public was there, and it's very, for someone to experience rape and sexual abuse, it's very traumatic, but it also, it was done and it humiliated the person because they did it in front of individuals as well. And there's accounts of many females that were, they were forced to get out. They had a decision, either they would stay in the house, or they had to get out of the house, but they were naked, and they would still choose to run away due to safety, and just thinking about how you would feel during that time if you were in that position. And lastly is shame. So I'm pretty sure you've seen pictures of a lot of Sikhs. The turbans, the bottom was taken off. Actually, the top of it was actually used to tie the men's arms. And you've seen pictures of this, and we know what the bottom is the key. And doing that, it brings a lot of disrespect, first of all, and also a lot of shame to a lot of men who didn't have their clothes on during that time. And on top of that, they were being tortured. So like I said, I'll be addressing the physical injuries along with the mental trauma. So the first one is the physical injuries. So these is just like a list from the Center of Victims of Torture of what happens during political torture in various countries. So the first one is like beating, suffocation, sexual assault and rape, being exposed to extreme heat and cold, hanging, burning, electric shock. And this list is just, it's a list that the Center for Victims of Torture had created, but it's important to realize that this list varies for every individual. It might be more extensive for certain individuals. For many individuals that were freedom fighters that were up there and fighting, this list is probably more greater because they were experiencing a lot of political torture during that time. And on the corner here, I have a quote. This is actually a Punjabi Sikh woman, and she reported that this is what she experienced during 1990. And the reason I'm telling you the date is 1990 is that a lot of things were happening after 84. It's not that this is a quote from 84, it's from 1990. So a lot of political torture was happening even after 84. And this woman reported, "I was slapped and thrown to the ground. Several men stretched my legs apart. The pain was unbearable. Then they used 2 wire clips to give electric shocks to my ears and toes. I lost consciousness, twice. While I was still standing on the floor, they moved a heavy roller over my thighs. After 5 days, I was relieved." Just looking at this quote and looking at the list, you can tell there was very intense torture that was happening during this time. And this woman didn't disclose anything of how her ties were to the government or anything. It could be, any civilian on the street that could have been tortured like this. And so the second part is the psychological impacts of torture. During political torture times, there's a lot of psychological impacts because of the trauma experienced during that time. And these include depression, anxiety, lack of energy, decreased interest in relationships, insomnia, memory loss, and post-traumatic stress syndrome, so PTSD. And PTSD, it goes back to the DSM, which a lot of psychologists would be diagnosing. So a lot of, if we go back to this list, it would be like, so I'm actually saying phrases in Punjabi with how the Sikh Punjabi community would probably describe their symptoms. So these are like typical symptoms that are present in PTSD, and there's this big factor of fear. And it doesn't go away. It happens even after they, for instance, what if they did get political asylum and they came to the U.S., the fear is still there. And so, unfortunately, there's not that much academic studies on Punjabi Sikhs. And this is one of the rare ones that I found that were looking at psychological impacts of political torture. And so they actually conducted a study on 116 Punjabi Sikhs, and they were survivors of the human rights violations. And they looked at physical and psychological trauma, and it's important to note that the sample that the participants were retrieved from a class action, a lawsuit for illegally cremating Sikhs. So like going back to that quote that I mentioned in the last quote. And so if you look at the study, the diagram on your left, it basically shows that there was, so prolonged injuries during torture actually was a major predictor of PTSD and depression. And so if you look at the diagram, there's a relationship between torture and PTSD. That relationship is, the chronic injury is the mediator, which means that that relationship between torture and PTSD wouldn't be there. It had to do with chronic injury. And going back to the quotes that I presented, there was intense chronic injuries happening due to the torture that a lot of Sikhs were enduring during that time. Yeah, so again, unfortunately, there hasn't been that many academic research. This was, the one I just presented was one of the few that I found. But that just shows how important it is to do